Welcome to another episode of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, a podcast that unearths the forgotten corners of history and brings them back into the light. Each episode goes beyond headlines and textbook dates into the places, decisions, and moments that helped shape our world, even if they were left off the official record. These stories are built from archives, old photographs, and the physical traces still etched into the landscape. Here's your host, photographer, historian, and the creator of Restoration Obscura, John Bulmer.
Welcome to the Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast. I'm John Bulmer, the creator of Restoration Obscura. In this episode of the Field Guide, we're exploring 3 nights when cities were swallowed by darkness, nights when the lights failed and people had to rediscover how to live without them. These events were more than just power outages. They were moments of cultural exposure when systems faltered and the human response became the story. We'll move through 3 blackouts that changed how we understand urban life. In Act 1, we return to the Northeast in the fall of 1965 when a relay in Ontario failed and 1,000 miles of modern civilization disappeared in minutes. In Act 2, we step into the heat-soaked collapse of 1977 when New York's blackout cracked open the fears the city was already carrying. And in Act 3, we arrive in 2003, wired, digital, post 9/11, and still vulnerable to the dark. Each of these nights revealed something different. Each one exposed the psychology of its time. With that, let's begin. Act 1, 1965, the night the stars came back. At 5:16 p.m. on November 9th, 1965, something invisible failed. There was no explosion, no roar, no plume of smoke, just a sudden fault buried inside a machine built to prevent disaster. The origin point was miles away from the people it would affect. Near the Niagara River, just beyond the Canadian border, the Sir Adam Beck generating station was pushing out hydroelectric power like it had for decades. Giant turbines converted the river's force into current, which flowed into the grid, moving east and south like veins beneath the skin of a continent. The grid itself was considered secure, an engineered web of redundancy designed to keep cities alive. But one device misread the load. A protective relay, placed along a key transmission line, had been set just a little too sensitively. Its job was to act as a circuit breaker if current ever surged beyond safe limits. On this day, the setting was off. So it tripped, and the system began to unravel. First, one transmission line dropped offline. Power from the Beck station was instantly rerouted to neighboring lines which strained under the unexpected load. They tripped 2, one by one. Automatic breakers opened. Substations overloaded. Power stations tried to compensate by pushing out more current, but there was nowhere to send it. In milliseconds, the energy ricocheted through the network like a charge with no destination. Control rooms across Ontario lit up with alarms. In Albany, Boston, New York. Engineers were already on phones trying to assess what was happening, but it was too late. The collapse was happening at the speed of light. In less than 10 minutes, over 30 million people had lost power. 800,000 square miles were dark. From the suburbs of Toronto to the heart of Manhattan, from western New England to central Pennsylvania, the grid had failed. It was the largest blackout in North American history. And it happened just as the workday was ending. This was rush hour. Subways were filled with commuters, shoulder to shoulder, gripping metal poles, watching the stations blur past. Elevators ascended through Midtown towers, carrying typists, clerks, and brokers toward the exits. Televisions in living rooms flashed images of the evening news. Supermarkets bustled with shoppers. Restaurants were just beginning to fill. Then everything paused. People remember that moment as a strange, sudden stillness. Fluorescent lights blinked once. twice, then nothing. In apartments and offices, televisions froze and snapped to black. Radios faded to static. Refrigerators went silent. Streetlights winked out in a slow cascade, one intersection after another, like dominoes laid across 5 states. Elevators stopped between floors, jolting their passengers into darkness. Subway cars halted in the tunnels, plunging riders into thick, unlit air. Commuters stood confused in packed cars. No announcements, no emergency lights, just the absence of motion. On the streets, cars rolled to a stop, their headlights the only artificial glow left. Some scenes have been passed down like folklore. One man in Queens was halfway through lathering his face in front of the mirror. Another had just pulled a roast from the oven. In Buffalo, a family sat around the kitchen table, watching Walter Cronkite. A teenager in Albany had just dropped the needle on a vinyl record. In New Haven, an entire operating room froze mid-surgery, surgeons holding instruments, waiting for backup power that didn't come. All of it paused. Mid-sentence. Mid-step. The world didn't stop. It stalled, and in that stall, something strange settled into the air, something that felt at first like confusion, and then wonder. In Manhattan, in midtown office buildings, people climbed stairwells by flashlight or by the glow of cigarette lighters. On Wall Street, clerks lit candles to close out the day's trades by hand. Outside, the streets turned eerie. Traffic lights blinked out. Neon signs disappeared. The constant electrical buzz of the city, the one no one noticed until it was gone, evaporated. Counterintuitively, what followed wasn't panic. Cabs turned on their dome lights and slowed. Police officers stepped into intersections and began directing traffic with hand signals. Store owners lit lanterns and welcomed people in off the sidewalks. Strangers stood together on corners, waiting for instructions, listening to transistor radios that now served as lifelines. The city held its breath, but it didn't fall apart. There's a reason people remember the 1965 blackout differently. The darkness came quickly, but not with violence. The Cold War had taught people to expect sudden disruption, so when the lights went out and there were no sirens, no flash, no mushroom cloud, only silence. Many were relieved. In Field Guide to the Night, we talked about how darkness sharpens what we hear. In 1965, people heard things they hadn't heard in years. The creak of floorboards, the ticking of clocks, the hush of wind through alleyways, voices unfiltered by machines. The world got quieter, but more vivid. And then came the stars. For the first time in decades, the night sky returned over the Northeast. The haze of electric light that blanketed the cities lifted. On rooftops, in parks, on balconies, and sidewalks, people looked up and saw the Milky Way. There are stories of people calling the police to report strange, glowing patterns in the sky. Emergency dispatchers fielded calls from people who had never seen so many stars before. Whether those stories are true or embellished doesn't matter much. What matters is that for millions, it was the first time they remembered the sky as ancient and infinite. That alone gave the blackout its mythic title, The Night the Stars Came Back. Power returned slowly. In many areas, it was a matter of hours. In others, it stretched toward morning. When the lights returned, there was cheering in some neighborhoods. There was disappointment in others. A strange nostalgia had settled into the dark. Newspapers captured the feeling in headlines. Blackout shows humanity still intact. The tone was one of wonder, of pride, of the relief that maybe things hadn't fallen apart after all. In the days that followed, engineers launched a full investigation. The cause, once traced, seemed laughably small, one relay out of calibration. a single weak link in a system designed to carry cities. There were reforms, protections added, new safeguards. But what endured wasn't the technical story, it was the cultural one. 1965 became a symbol of urban resilience, proof that in a moment of unexpected stillness, people could rediscover community. That beneath the hum of machines, something human remained. Of course, memory trims the edges. The 1965 blackout was fortunate in its timing. It struck during what many later called America's last age of optimism, a brief calm before the unraveling. The nation was still living in the afterglow of post-war confidence, even as it carried the lingering grief of President Kennedy's assassination 2 years earlier. The war in Vietnam was escalating, but most people still believed it could be won, and few yet questioned the government's word. The Cold War lent a sense of unity, a shared mission against a common threat. Trust in institutions, in science, and in progress itself still held. People were stressed, but they still believed the system could be trusted. So when the lights went out, people filled the gap with cooperation. And when the stars came back, they didn't feel like an omen. They felt like a gift. Within a few short years, that confidence would fracture. The assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. tore open the nation's conscience. Cities erupted in anger. Watts in 65, Newark and Detroit in 67. Then the long hot summer of 1968, when more than 100 cities burned after King's death. The anti-war movement surged into mass protest, campuses filled with tear gas and fear. And at Kent State, National Guardsmen fired on unarmed students. The social fabric frayed in full view. By decade's end, the calm cooperation of 1965 felt like a relic. The blackout had arrived at the last moment when Americans still believed the system could be trusted, when darkness could feel like a pause instead of a warning. But 12 years later, the story would unfold differently. Because in 1977, when the lights failed again, the city wasn't in a place of optimism. It was in crisis, and this time, the dark wouldn't be as gentle. That's where we go next. Act 2, 1977, The Bronx is Burning. It began with heat. Not the dry kind that lifts dust in wide open spaces. This was old New York heat, dense and sour, pressing against you with the weight of pavement, brick, and old steam. It was a smothering heat. It crawled into subway tunnels, settled in alleys, ripened trash bags on the curb, and turned tenement walls into radiators. The city was its own furnace. Decades of asphalt masonry and exhaust trapped the day's heat long after sunset, a phenomenon scientists would later call the urban heat island. You didn't need data to understand it. You could feel it rising from the streets, radiating from rooftops, pulsing from every metal surface. The temperature in the boroughs could run 10 degrees hotter than the countryside just a few miles away. Concrete stored the day's sun and released it slowly, hour after hour, as if the city itself refused to cool. In July of 1977, that heat didn't just fill the air, it filled people. It sharpened tempers, slowed thought, made the smallest things feel heavy. Even the wind, when it moved, carried heavy warmth instead of relief. They were sticky nights, the kind when the dark pressed close and the only comfort came from a single window fan pushing thick air in slow, uneven circles. The city seemed to stop breathing after sunset, its pulse buried beneath the weight of heat that refused to lift. July 13th, 1977. The fifth straight day of a heat wave that hadn't broken once. Temperatures clung to the upper 90s. Humidity hovered near 90%. The sky was the wrong color. Not blue, not gray. Just dull and metallic. like the lid of an overused pot. Air quality alerts had become background noise. Ozone warnings came and went. By morning, the city was sweating. By midday, it was boiling. By dusk, it was buckling. Inside apartment buildings, fans clattered like broken clocks. Metal blades chopped thick air without cooling it. Children lay on linoleum floors in their underwear, spraying themselves with water from plastic bottles. Mothers stood by open windows, hoping for a tremor in the curtain. You could smell the electricity straining. Window units buzzed and kicked and failed over and over. In the Bronx, families sat outside on stoops with damp towels around their shoulders. In Harlem, elderly residents parked lawn chairs on sidewalks and watched traffic creep past. In Bed-Stuy, kids ran through illegally opened hydrants, water arcing into the street like a brief escape. On fire escapes, people curled into damp sheets, hoping the brick wouldn't radiate heat all night. Some didn't even try to sleep. They just waited. Inside bodegas, coolers moaned. Owners dabbed their foreheads with paper towels, counted inventory, and prayed the power would hold. In apartment kitchens, refrigerator doors were opened only when necessary. People worried about spoiled milk, thawing meat, what to do if the lights went out. Air conditioners, if you had one, labored under the heat. They groaned, coughed, dripped, sputtered, and rattled the walls. Yet even in their protest, they stayed on, because the alternative was worse. On the streets, the mood was brittle. Tempers were short and had been for years. This wasn't the kind of heat that merely inconvenienced. It stripped patience, amplified every sound, the neighbor's radio, a barking dog until it vibrated behind your eyes. People argued in traffic, on stoops, in corner stores with empty freezer cases. There was no breeze, no relief, only stillness, sweat, and a creeping sense that the city couldn't take much more. By dusk, New York was already cracking. The blackout wouldn't cause the collapse. It would simply let it through. The city that lost power in 1977 wasn't the one that had marveled at the stars 12 years earlier. This was a different New York, hollowed out and on edge. The manufacturing base had collapsed. Unemployment climbed toward 1 million. Abandoned buildings stood like missing teeth across the Bronx and Brooklyn. Landlords torched their own properties for insurance. Graffiti spread across subway cars like mold. Crime rates surged past every record. Only 2 years earlier, the city had nearly gone bankrupt. President Ford's refusal of federal aid had led to the "Ford to City Drop Dead" headline, a symbol of abandonment. Garbage strikes had left trash mountains on curbs. Police layoffs cut patrols to the bone. Firehouses closed while arson climbed. And in that same summer of 1977, a serial killer haunted the boroughs. Son of Sam had already shot 6 people, scrawling letters to the press in taunting handwriting. Every parked car and every dark street carried its own kind of fear. The city's nerves were already raw before the power failed. The long, hot summers of the late 60s still haunted the country. Watts, Newark, Detroit, and the riots that followed Dr. King's assassination had left burn marks on the national psyche. The optimism of 1965 was long gone. Kent State had shown what government fear looked like when it turned on its own children. By 1977, hope felt naive. What remained was endurance. The failure began, as before, far from the people who would live with its consequences. About 40 miles north of the Bronx, the land tilts into the lower Hudson Valley. where high-voltage lines thread through the trees in long cleared bands, carrying power from upstate and across the Canadian border into the heart of the city. That evening, the sky over Westchester was restless. Thunderheads pressed against the horizon. The air felt metallic. At 8:37 p.m., lightning struck a transmission line near the Buchanan substation, a feeder connecting the Indian Point nuclear plant to New York's grid. The line tripped offline, routine protection. It should have ended there, but the system was already straining. 2 major steam plants were offline for maintenance. Demand was at peak. Air conditioners were pulling current by the ton. The grid's margin for error was gone. At 8:55, lightning struck again. A second line failed. Power was rerouted, overloading the rest. Then came a third strike. The grid began collapsing in real time. At Con Ed's control room on East 14th Street, engineers stood before schematic panels the size of walls. Breakers opened like falling dominoes. Lights shifted from green to red. Needles dropped to zero. Phones rang in bursts. Operators shouted over each other. They tried to start gas turbine backups. No sync. They tried to manually engage the East River plant. It was ready and fueled, but its safety logic read the surge as catastrophic and locked the system down. Someone reached for the manual override. Too late. At 9:27 p.m., the last major breaker tripped. At 9:34, the final feeder line into New York City dropped offline. The city went dark. The blackouts swept south in seconds. The Bronx first, then Harlem, Midtown, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island. Within minutes, the world's largest city disappeared. Towers vanished. Neon fizzled out. Times Square fell silent. Elevators froze. Subways stopped. Cash registers died mid-transaction. The city held its breath. Some thought it was war. Others thought it was Son of Sam. Most just waited, eyes lifted toward the dark ceiling of the sky. But waiting didn't last long. In Crown Heights, looters shattered a jewelry store window and passed watches hand to hand. In Bushwick, flames lit the night as entire buildings burned. In Brownsville, a car rammed a storefront gate and a crowd followed. Firefighters were pulled from one blaze to the next without rest. Some stores were hit twice. First by residents, then by organized crews in stolen trucks. Electronics, sneakers, furniture, medicine, anything that could be carried was gone. By midnight, more than 1,000 fires burned. By dawn, entire blocks had disappeared. Yet even amid the chaos, there were small resistances. In Washington Heights, a retired cop directed traffic with a flashlight for hours. In the South Bronx, volunteers stood guard outside bodegas. In Queens, families rolled grills onto sidewalks, cooking thawing food for neighbors. On Avenue C, a school custodian powered an elderly care center with his own generator. Not everyone looted. Most adapted. They shared water, swapped batteries, checked stairwells. They stayed awake because sleep in the dark didn't feel safe. Nearly 3,800 arrests followed. The number became shorthand for the night, alongside the names of the neighborhoods left gutted: Bushwick, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and Morrisania. Some never recovered. Insurance didn't cover losses. Federal aid came slow. Shop owners locked their gates for good. Where stores once anchored corners, gaps open and filled with weeds. The damage was physical, economic, psychological, and civic. Still, by the next evening, the lights began to return, neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block. But the city that woke wasn't the one that had gone to sleep. In some places, there was cheering. In others, quiet resignation. Photographers captured shopkeepers sweeping glass. Firefighters leaning against blackened walls. Children playing in hydrant spray beside piles of ash. A woman taped a cardboard sign to a shattered window that read, "Nothing left to steal." Politicians scrambled for explanations. Mayor Abe Beame blamed Con Edison. Con Edison blamed weather and chance. The public blamed everyone. Tabloids screamed, "Blackout brings city to its knees. New York burns in the dark." Hearings were held, reports written, testimonies delivered. But none of it changed the simple truth people had witnessed firsthand. When the lights failed, so did everything built on the assumption they'd always stay on. Unlike 1965, this blackout didn't end with wonder at the night sky. It ended with vacancy and exhaustion, with boarded windows and the slow retreat of hope. Still, in the darkness, there were flickers. People talking on stoops, radios on low as a link to the outside world, reminiscent of radio broadcasts received behind enemy lines. Children sleeping in hallways while adults kept watch. In Field Guide to the Night, I wrote that darkness sharpens the senses, that it reveals what light conceals. The 1977 blackout wasn't about electricity alone. It was about pressure, about everything the decade had buried finally rising to the surface. This was a city at the edge of itself, holding on to whatever it could, a neighbor, a radio, a flame. The 1977 blackout wasn't just a night of darkness. It was a mirror held up to a city already burning from the inside out. It revealed what years of neglect, fear, and exhaustion had hidden. By the time the lights came back, New York had seen itself without disguise, raw, exposed, and alive in ways both terrifying and human. For some, that night never ended. It remained in the boarded windows, the hollowed storefronts, the memory of heat that wouldn't lift. It became part of the city's nervous system, a pulse that never quite settled. And yet, even through the smoke and silence, people rebuilt. The city tightened its circuits, hardened its edges, and carried that memory forward like a warning written in light. Because in 2003, when the grid failed again, the world that went dark wasn't the same. The skyline had changed. The towers were gone. In their place, cranes rose over ground zero, and the sound of rebuilding mixed with the memory of planes low and fast over Manhattan. New York was living under orange and red terror alerts, trained to look for unattended bags, trained to see something, say something. The fear was different now. Sharper, quieter, more personal. That's where we go next. Into a wired city rebuilt from loss, alive with data and surveillance. A city that thought it could never be caught unprepared again, until the lights went out one more time. Act 3, 2003. The Fragile Grid. I remember that day vividly. August 14th, 2003. It was a hot afternoon in August. The kind of summer day upstate New York does perfectly. Bright, heavy with warmth, and impossibly clear. The sky was the same hard blue it had been 2 years earlier. What pilots call severe clear. In Troy, the lights dimmed briefly. Just a flicker, a momentary sigh of the grid, but they never went out. Some parts of the capital region weren't so lucky. I spent the afternoon inside, behind the steady wall of central air conditioning, cable news murmuring in the background. Anchors broke in with the urgency of half-formed facts. Cleveland, Detroit, Toronto, New York City. Entire regions were shutting down. The maps glowed red while experts guessed in real time, their anchors trying to describe what they didn't yet understand. This was the 2003 blackout, the largest in North American history. 50 million people across 8 states and Ontario lost power. Offices and schools closed. Airports went dark. Water systems faltered. For 2 days, the Northeast stumbled through a suspension of the modern world. And in those first hours, the story wasn't only about electricity. It was about the memory of that terrible Tuesday morning in 2001. Just 2 years had passed since the towers fell, since the smoke and the ash rolled down the avenues, since the skyline changed forever. In the months that followed, letters laced with anthrax arrived in mailrooms and newsrooms, killing 5 and unsettling millions. Then came the DC snipers, 2 men firing from a car trunk, turning gas stations and parking lots into places of terror. The country had entered what was being called the Global War on Terror, a conflict that stretched from distant battlefields to airports, inboxes, and into daily life. People were told to live in alertness, to calibrate fear against the color-coded chart: green, yellow, orange, and red. So when the lights failed, the reflex was suspicion. I remember anchors speculating: a cyber attack? A bomb on a transmission line? A strike against the grid itself? Every scenario felt possible because America had already seen how fast the ordinary could collapse. The truth was smaller, but no less revealing. It began in Ohio. A transmission line sagged in the heat, drooping into untrimmed trees. The line tripped and shut down. Its load shifted to other lines, which overheated and sagged in turn. In the control room of First Energy in Akron, alarms failed. Operators didn't recognize the scale. As the cascade spread, the chance to stop it slipped away. By the time it reached New York, it was already irreversible. At 4:10 p.m., the city went dark. Subways stalled in tunnels. Bridges filled with pedestrians walking home. Traffic lights blinked out, replaced by hand signals and whistles. Office workers poured into the streets, cell phones useless in connecting to an overloaded network. Grocery stores locked their doors. Pumps slowed. The scenes were eerily familiar, echoing the hours after 9/11, when thousands walked off the island of Manhattan in silence, carrying the same uneasy mix of confusion, relief, and dread. Yet this time, the city held. There were no riots, no fires racing through the boroughs. There was the hard-won understanding of what to do in a regional, a national emergency. The difference was experience. This was a city that had already lived through catastrophe. The skyline itself had been rewritten. People had practiced what sudden loss felt like. So in 2003, darkness arrived as a test of composure. Candles lit stairwells. Police officers directed traffic with flares. Strangers shared water. Radios carried voices that steadied the air. The fear was still there, but it moved inward, contained, familiar, manageable. Across the region, similar stories unfolded. In Detroit, lines of cars idled at gas stations that couldn't pump. In Toronto, towers glowed faint orange on backup power before fading. In Cleveland, people slept on sidewalks waiting for trains that never came. It was all a reminder of how thin the tether really was. Everywhere, people improvised. Coolers of ice, candles in jars, neighbors knocking on doors, cable networks looped aerials of darkened skylines, bridges crowded with walkers, the Northeast swallowed in black. And always, the same question, was this deliberate? By morning, investigators traced the origin to Ohio. Trees, failed alarms, human error. Even with answers, the unease stayed, because the truth felt worse than sabotage. It hadn't taken a weapon, it had taken a branch and a broken monitor. The revelation was fragility itself. For those who lived through it, 2003 wasn't a night of stars like 1965 or a fire like 1977. It was quieter, a blackout measured in patience and reflection. Ted Koppel would later call that fragility by name in Lights Out, published in 2015. His reporting was calm, methodical, and that made it frightening. He asked one question: what happens when the lights don't come back? He spoke with Pentagon officials, cyber defense analysts, and emergency planners. Their answers were blunt. The grid is exposed, not only by storms or lightning, but to intrusion. They pointed to California, where in 2013, an unknown team staged a silent assault on the Metcalf transmission substation south of San Jose, just after midnight. Phone lines were cut, cell towers jammed, and then, from a nearby hillside, rifle fire cracked through the dark. More than 100 rounds were fired with precision, each one striking transformers filled with cooling oil. Within minutes, 17 massive units bled out and overheated. The attackers vanished before police arrived. Investigators later described it as a coordinated professional operation. No fingerprints, no casings, no messages, just deliberate damage. The site was chosen carefully, the tactics refined. It looked less like vandalism and more like a rehearsal, a probing action meant to see how quickly the system could respond, how long it would take to repair, and whether anyone was truly watching behind those smoked black domes protecting surveillance cameras. Koppel included it as a warning. The grid's vulnerabilities weren't theoretical. They had already been exposed. Regional networks are managed by thousands of companies, many running industrial control software first written decades ago, and then patched until no one remembers the original code. A skilled attacker wouldn't need explosives. They could alter software, flip protection settings, and make machines behave in ways operators never intended. We already saw how that can happen. In 2010, a digital weapon called Stuxnet appeared in Iran. It was discovered after hundreds of centrifuges at the Natanz nuclear enrichment facility began failing for no apparent reason. Investigators later found the cause wasn't mechanical. It was code-based. The worm had slipped through USB drives into Siemens industrial controllers, silently rewriting their commands. On screen, everything looked normal, but underground, the centrifuges were spinning themselves to destruction. Stuxnet was a joint U.S.-Israeli operation, the first known cyber weapon to inflict kinetic damage on another nation's infrastructure. It was precise, patient, and devastating. It wasn't just espionage. It was a use case, a demonstration that lines of code could translate into kinetic force. It proved something no one had fully believed until then. Software could reach through wires and damage the real world. Then, in 2015 and 2016, the lessons turned global. In Ukraine, hackers penetrated regional utilities and shut down entire sections of the power grid, tripping circuit breakers remotely, and erasing logs so engineers couldn't see what was happening. It was the first confirmed cyber attack to cause a nationwide blackout. Together, these events traced a clear evolution from malware that sabotaged Iran's centrifuges to bullets that tore through a California substation to keystrokes that silenced cities overseas. When code can change currents and currents move cities, the threat isn't theoretical anymore. It's the physical expression of vulnerability. The same fragility Metcalf exposed with gunfire and Ukraine revealed through malware. The defenses that slow that threat are both digital and physical. Tighter segmentation between corporate networks and operational control systems. Careful patching and inventory of legacy devices. Anomaly detection that watches for commands that don't make sense. And the basic hardening of substations and transformers so a probing action meets resistance. Those measures won't end the threat, but they make intrusion harder to turn into a collapse. Koppel reported what intelligence agencies already understood. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Each had the capability and each had tested it. Some had already left malware inside American utilities, silent and waiting. He pressed further. If the grid stays down, then what? Hospitals would run on generators until the fuel was gone. Water systems would fail once pumps stopped. Grocery shelves would empty. Gas stations would close. Trucks would halt. Supply chains would unravel. Tens of millions in cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Houston would lose food, water, heat, and medicine. There is no national plan for that. FEMA's warehouses hold blankets and bottled water, but not the capacity to sustain entire populations. The revelation wasn't only that the grid could fall, it was that no one was ready for what came after. Imagine if the blackout of 2003 had lasted 2 months instead of a few days. Imagine a winter without the confidence of electricity, without the quiet promise that light returns with a switch. That is the possibility Koppel asked us to face. Our fascination with darkness is rooted in human nature. We return to it in stories because it's the one scenario that still feels believable. In October 2013, National Geographic aired American Blackout, a hybrid documentary and dramatization that asked a single question: what happens when the lights go out and don't come back? Told through found footage and digital fragments, cell phone clips, news feeds, webcam diaries, it built its realism from the same tools it imagined failing. The story unfolded over 10 days, as a nationwide power outage forced Americans to confront how completely life had come to depend on invisible systems. The film's style was unnervingly intimate. It didn't use grand cinematic angles or omniscient narration. It used the eyes of ordinary people. A college student trapped in an elevator, a prepper family sealing their home, teenagers recording their panic on phones that slowly lost power. The blackout became personal, shrinking the apocalypse down to the glow of a dying battery. American Blackout wasn't a horror story. It was a mirror. It captured the cultural unease of the post-9/11 decade, when fear had moved from foreign enemies to the fragility of everyday life. Its tone was documentary reel, stitched together from confessionals and news bulletins, showing how quickly a wired civilization could unravel once the current stopped. The quiet message beneath the panic was the same one that's haunted every blackout since 1965. That technology hasn't made us invincible, only dependent, and that when the screen goes dark, we're left with ourselves. Emergency planners have a phrase that sums up the aftermath of a prolonged outage: 9 meals to chaos. 3 days without food, that's all it takes. The logic is simple. 3 meals a day for 3 days. After that, the stores are empty, the trucks have stopped, and hunger begins to reorder everything. Our entire civilization runs on a supply chain measured in hours. The grocery store is the front line of stability. When the power fails, refrigeration stops, pumps stall, credit systems freeze. Within a day, the shelves thin. By the second, the crowds grow sharp and restless. By the third, the pattern breaks. We caught a glimpse of that equation during the first weeks of the COVID-19 lockdowns, when the just-in-time economy met its first global stress test. Shelves emptied overnight. Pasta, flour, disinfectant, and most famously, toilet paper vanished. Trucks slowed, warehouses closed, ports stalled. For decades, supply chains had been engineered for precision, not endurance. Every factory, warehouse, and supermarket operated on the assumption that tomorrow's delivery would always arrive. When borders tightened and workers stayed home, that rhythm broke. Grocery aisles became barometers of anxiety. People bought not just what they needed, but what they feared might disappear. The term just in time revealed its other meaning. Just in time to fail. It wasn't collapse on the scale of a blackout, but it carried the same lesson. The distance between abundance and scarcity isn't measured in miles or hours. It's measured in meals. The phrase 9 meals to chaos traces back to planners and defense analysts. Men who studied the behavior of cities during wartime, hurricanes, and grid failures. Their findings were always the same. Hunger turns fear into movement. People leave apartments, cross bridges, gather where they think help might come. Authority erodes. Order disappears. We enter what's termed whirl, WWORL, world without rule of law. The blackout becomes more than darkness. It becomes a social experiment in how long decency can last without light, without power, without food. We see this played out in real time in American Blackout. 9 meals to chaos. That's the measure of distance between order and desperation. The thin margin we live inside every day without realizing it. Cormac McCarthy's The Road imagined a world where the lights never came back. The air is thick with ash, the sun hidden, the seasons erased. Cities exist only as outlines, hollowed towers, bridges over dry riverbeds, highways littered with relics of the old world. A father and son move through this ruin carrying a single flame, both literal and moral, trying to remember what goodness feels like in a place that's forgotten the concept of mourning. McCarthy stripped civilization down to its bones. No governments, no maps, no promise of rescue, only the fragile thread between two people refusing to surrender their humanity to the dark. The book isn't about apocalypse in the cinematic sense. It's about continuity. What still binds us when everything else has been burned away. In that silence, survival becomes an act of faith and memory, the last form of light. Television series like Revolution and The Walking Dead reimagined cities emptied of current and order. Even children's books remember that tremor when the flashlight flickers and the batteries fade. We're drawn to these stories because the idea is embedded in our human nature. The vulnerabilities remain everywhere. Aging transformers that take years to replace. Software never designed for security. A network split among thousands of private owners, each guarding its own piece. The grid was built for efficiency, not endurance. And that's what's the most terrifying. Collapse often starts small. A wire, a storm, a line of code. If it happens again, if the power disappears for weeks or months, hospitals, pumps, trucks, and markets will all stop in sequence, halted by the gravity of dependence and interdependence. Looking back on 2003, it's easy to remember the patience. The strangers guiding each other with flashlights. The small kindnesses that made survival possible. That grace was real, yet the blackout also exposed something deeper. How little stands between light and chaos. The darkness of 2003 carried no wonder, no rage. It carried a warning that our bright, connected world can still be undone by the smallest of failures, and that resilience begins only when the lights are gone. The grid is invisible and essential, the nervous system of modern life, and it's always closer to failure than we like to believe. And when that happens, the question isn't how long the blackout lasts. It's what the darkness shows us this time. Because every blackout is a mirror, and in its reflection, we see ourselves. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide. I'm John Bulmer. Until next time, take care. I'm excited to share that my new book, Restoration Obscura's Field Guide to the Night, is now available. This project grew out of the same work you hear on this podcast. It's an immersive history of how night has shaped human experience, from the first sky watchers and their constellations, to the wartime blackouts that changed daily life, to the hidden surveillance networks of the Cold War. It's part cultural history, part personal journey, and it invites us to step beyond today's artificial glow and rediscover what still lives in the shadows. Field Guide to the Night is available worldwide in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. If you've been enjoying the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, our deep dives into forgotten history, lost infrastructure, and the legends of the past, there's a way to be part of the story behind the scenes. We're currently welcoming select sponsorship partners for upcoming episodes and articles. Whether you're an independent brand, museum, publisher, archive, or just someone who believes in the power of storytelling, this is your chance to reach an engaged, history-loving audience across Substack, Facebook, Instagram, and all major streaming platforms. If your mission aligns with ours, preserving the past, exploring the overlooked, or just digging deeper than the headlines, we'd love to connect. For sponsor opportunities and media inquiries, contact restorationobscura@gmail.com. Let's bring more forgotten stories to light together. If you believe history is worth preserving, if you've ever paused at the ruins of an old mill or held a faded photograph and wondered about the world it came from, this space is for you. The Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast streams on all major platforms. Subscribe to support independent, reader-funded storytelling at restorationobscura.com. Copyright 2025, John Bulmer Media and Restoration Obscura. All rights reserved. Restoration Obscura explores forgotten places and overlooked histories. Visiting abandoned sites can be dangerous, unstable, and often illegal. This podcast does not encourage or endorse trespassing, vandalism, or unsafe exploration. Please respect property laws, community safety, and historic preservation efforts. Restoration Obscura draws on a range of materials, including public archives, institutional holdings, and privately preserved collections. Many images and documents have uncertain or incomplete provenance. When possible, sources are identified and credited. While we work to preserve and interpret these materials with care, not all rights of ownership reside with Restoration Obscura. All information is verified as accurate at the time of publication.
This was a Restoration Obscura broadcast. Archive reference terminated. Operation complete. Restoration Obscura signing off.